Guys, here we go for part 2. This should be your Wednesday assignment, though none of you are doing these on the right days, so this is just part 2. Alright, watch this video, what you're doing. Check. And then I'm going to read the document to you and kind of explain it, and then you'll answer the question. Sorry, my cat was like chewing at my fingers. Anyway, here we go. So, directions. Read this excerpt. Excerpt means a part. From the 1960 Sitting Down to Take a Stand by Suzanne Bilyeu from New York Times Upfront. Ow, 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 ow. Sorry, guys. I can't had her whole claw in my hand. Stop that. Okay, so you're going to read this and answer the questions. So it is called 1960 Sitting Down to Take a Stand. She wrote this in 2010, though, so she wrote it about her experiences 50 years before. When? 50 years ago, 4 students sat down at Borough, North Carolina. They helped reignite the civil rights movement. It says the article is excerpted, which means parts were cut out to fill in 2 pages. They just made it shorter. It was shortly after 4 in the afternoon when 4 college freshmen, so they're in their first year of college, entered the Woolworth store in downtown Greensboro, North Carolina. They purchased a few small items, school supplies and toothpaste, and were careful to keep their receipts, right? The paper that says they bought them. Then they sat down at the store's lunch counter and ordered coffee. "I'm sorry," said the waitress. "We do not serve Negroes here." "I beg to differ," said one of the students. He pointed out that the store had just served them and accepted their money at a counter just a few feet away, and they had the receipts to prove it, right? They had bought stuff, so clearly you do serve us. A black woman working at the lunch counter scolded the students for trying to stir up trouble, and the store manager asked them to leave. But the 4 young men sat quietly at the lunch counter until the store closed at 5:30. Ezekiel Blair Jr., Franklin McCann, Joseph McNeil, and David Richmond, now known as the Greensboro Four, were all students at North Carolina A&T, the Agricultural and Technical College, a black college in Greensboro. So they were college students in the same town. They were teenagers, barely out of high school. But on that Monday afternoon, February 1st of 1960, they started a movement that changed America. A decade of protest. The Greensboro sit-in 50 years ago, and those that followed, ignited a decade of civil rights protests in the U.S. A decade is 10 years. It was a departure, a leaving, from the approach of the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the leading civil rights group at the time, which focused on challenging segregation in the courts, right? So the NAACP was really focusing on the laws and the courts and trying to make sure that stuff was legal or illegal for African Americans in America. This kind of was different. This was with the people. This was not a legal issue. This was a people being discriminating against these young men who just wanted some coffee. The sit-ins showed that Americans, and young people in particular, could protest against segregation directly and have a real impact, right? They said, this is what young people can do. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to be someone fancy and powerful. You can just do something little to protest. The civil rights movement would have moved much slower, would have accomplished far fewer victories, right? It wouldn't have been as successful if you had not had those students sit in, and the entry to the movement was all young energy, right? They're saying this wouldn't have worked if you didn't have young people helping you out. Says Alden Morris, author of The Origins of the Civil Rights Movement. 6 years after the landmark Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus Board of Education, Brown versus Board of Education was the law that said blacks and whites could and should go to the same school. You can't segregate them anymore. You can't segregate people in schools. The civil rights movement seemed to have stalled. It just kind of stopped. Some states virtually ignored the ruling. Jim Crow, remember when we learned about that? That's separate but equal. Laws and customs often prevailed, right? A lot of people didn't care about the real law. They only cared about that, about the separate but equal. and public facilities like hospitals and parks remained segregated, with water fountains and restrooms often designated as white or colored. The Greensboro sit-in happened at just the right time and place, according to William Schaaf, author of Civilities and Civil Rights, A History of Civil Rights in Greensboro. There was a growing impatience with the Black community over the absence of any significant progress on desegregation after Brown, right? So the Black community was like, come on, guys, like, let's do something, right? The law changed, now let's go. Both in Greensboro and throughout the country, says Schaaf. It was like a pent-up pressure ready to burst at the appropriate moment, and February 1st proved that moment. We absolutely had no choice. Before heading to Woolworth's, the students rehearsed how they would act and what they would say. When they sat down at the lunch counter, they fully expected to be arrested or worse. Right? Can you imagine if you just went to go have a coffee and someone arrested you for it? It's pretty extreme. I felt that this could be the last day of my life, recalls Franklin McCain, now 67, living in Charlotte, North Carolina. But I thought that it was well worth it, because to continue to live in that way we had been living, I questioned that. I'd made up my mind that we absolutely had no choice, right? He was ready to die that day, right? He thought this was so important that he was ready to die at that counter if need be to help get African Americans and Blacks more abilities, more rights in the nation. At the time, Woolworths was one of the world's largest retailers. Woolworths is kind of like a Fred Meyer, right? You can just get everything there. And the store in downtown Greensboro was one of its most profitable. It was a typical 5 and dime that sold all kinds of merchandise for less than $1. So I guess it's more like a Dollar Tree. And its lunch counter served about 2,000 meals a day. Curly Harris, the manager, didn't want any disruptions that would scare away customers. When the 4 Black men sitting at the lunch counter refused to leave, Harris told his staff, ignore them, just let them sit. The 4 returned the next morning along with 2 more A&T is their college, students, and took seats at the lunch counter. Some opened textbooks and studied, and occasionally they tried to order something. Otherwise, they were silent. By the end of the week, students from A&T and Bennett, which is a Black women's college in Greensboro, occupied all 66 seats at the Woolworth counter. A few white students joined in as well. Some whites in Greensboro supported the sit-ins, but others, including some of the Ku Klux Klan members, and remember that we didn't talk about them a ton, but they were the group of white people who hate and want to kill Black people. It's very intense. They're scary people. Resisted and taunting demonstrators with racial epithets, right, saying rude racial things at them, and taking seats at the Woolworth counter to keep Blacks from sitting there. On the Saturday after the sit-ins began, nearly 1,000 people crowded around the lunch counter before a bomb threat prompted the manager to close the store. So over time, they got 1,000 people to sit in there. Okay, but eventually someone threatened to set off a bomb, and so they had to close the store that day. The role of the media, so the news. During earlier sit-ins in the city, newspapers had buried the stories in the Black pages or didn't cover them at all. But the Greensboro Record ran the story on the front page of its local news section. Reporters from other news organizations began arriving, and on February 3rd, the New York Times, which is the biggest newspaper in our country, the New York Times ran the first of many articles about the sit-ins. Media coverage, news coverage, was one reason that the movement spread so quickly. The movement took off in other cities, and within days of the 4 students first sat down at the Woolworth sit-in were taking place across North Carolina. So it didn't stop at this one city, it kept going. She won't stop biting me, so I have to hold her. Look how pretty she is. I forgot where I was. Here we go. Students in Nashville, Tennessee held sit-ins at a number of stores. In New York, demonstrators picketed Woolworth stores in support of the students in North Carolina. Word of the sit-ins spread throughout the network of Black colleges, and groups like CORE, which is the Congress of Racial Equality, so a group in Washington, D.C. that tries to get equality for the different races. This is what she does. She just eats my fingers all day. And the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by Martin Luther King Jr., so he's involved now too. Over the next few months, 50,000 demonstrators would sit in at lunch counters in 100 southern cities. Martin Luther King, encouraged the students in their nonviolent campaign, telling them prepare to be arrested. 6 months after the sit-ins began, Harris, the manager of the Greensboro Woolworth, finally relented and the sit-ins had already cost him $150,000 in lost business, right? Because all these people were just sitting in there, he wasn't making any money because they weren't ordering food, or he wouldn't make them food. On July 25th of 1960, so let's see, all of February, March, April, May, June, and most of July, 6 months this went on. The lunch counter served its first Black customers. Civil Rights Act. Sit-ins and marches helped bring about support for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which eventually outlawed racial segregation, right? So this all helped lead to the law, and it's still the law today. The Civil Rights Act outlawed racial segregation altogether. It took a long time for people to start doing that, but the law said that in 1964. So you have questions, alrighty? You have 4 questions to answer. I'm not going to read them. You can read them. Have some practice. I'll let you read some things to yourself. All right, me and Kitten are signing off, and we're going to go try to film your last video. Goodbye.